So today we're really diving into the escalating tensions we're seeing in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And, it's a complex situation, obviously,
Yeah.
with a lot of history.
Mm-hmm.
But we're fortunate enough to have some really insightful analysis to dig into
Yeah, absolutely.
from a retired U.S. Army colonel who also served as a diplomat.
Interesting.
And he offered this really chilling prediction
Okay.
that Israel might be headed for what he calls a little bighorn moment.
Little Bighorn.
And
A bold statement for
Yeah,
sure.
it definitely caught my attention.
Yeah, and what's striking is he doesn't just throw this analogy around lightly.
Right.
He's really grounding it in his experience.
Yeah.
Both his military background
Right.
and his understanding of diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
And he points to these recent attacks on October 7th as a real turning point.
Oh,
He really sees these as profoundly shaking the Israeli leadership.
it's interesting you mentioned that because I was curious to get your take on how someone with his background views someone like Netanyahu's response to all of this.
Yeah, well, he sees Netanyahu as deeply fearful, honestly.
Really?
And as a result, pushing for what he calls a war of annihilation against...
War of annihilation.
It's strong language.
It is strong language.
But it speaks to the severity of the situation in his view.
So he doesn't see this as just about defense anymore.
No, this isn't about simply protecting Israel's borders. This is about total victory.
Wow.
A complete eradication of the enemy, which is a strategy he argues is both fundamentally flawed and incredibly dangerous.
Dangerous for the region or like on a global scale?
Both, actually. But before we get to the global implications, let's talk about the U.S. for a second.
Okay.
Because the colonel argues that the U.S. is deeply complicit in all of this.
Okay, so unpack that for me a little bit.
So he's saying it's not just that we're providing Israel with financial and military support, which we are, but it's that we're turning a blind eye to the potential consequences of this war of annihilation strategy.
He's suggesting we're not just bystanders.
No, not at all. In fact, he goes as far as to say that we might be more involved than we're letting on.
Really? How so?
Well, he hints at potential collusion in the events of October 7th.
Well, that's a bold claim.
It is.
Especially considering he seems to see October 7th as central to his whole narrative.
Absolutely. He positions those attacks as a turning point.
Okay.
Before that, there was a sense that maybe a different path was possible.
Mm-hmm.
But after the events of that day, and more importantly, the reactions to them, it seems like this dangerous trajectory toward conflict was solidified.
So where does Netanyahu fit into all of this?
The colonel paints a pretty stark picture, actually.
Huh.
He draws a parallel between Netanyahu and Hitler
Wow.
in the waning days of World War II.
That's a heavy comparison.
It is.
What specifically is he trying to convey with that?
It's about mindset. According to the colonel, both leaders found themselves increasingly isolated, facing mounting pressure on the world stage, and both clinging to an ideology that ultimately led to destruction.
It sounds like he's saying Netanyahu's actions are driven by a similar kind of fear and belief in his own invincibility.
Exactly, and that those actions are pushing Israel towards a similar precipice.
So he's gambling with the fate of his nation on a strategy that, by the colonel's analysis, might be inherently flawed.
He is, and what's fascinating is that this isn't playing out in a vacuum.
What do you mean?
Well, despite unwavering support from the U.S., there's growing international condemnation of Israel's actions.
Really, even from countries that were previously open to normalizing relations with Israel.
Precisely. The colonel points to a recent statement by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, calling for Israel to be held accountable for its actions.
That's a big deal.
It's a major shift in tone, and it signifies a growing unease, even among former allies, about the path Israel is taking.
So let's talk about this little bighorn prediction a little more. What exactly does he see happening?
So imagine this. Israel, believing in its own might, pushes forward convinced of its own invincibility.
Okay.
But they've miscalculated.
Oh.
Suddenly they're facing a united front.
Oh.
A coalition of enemies they underestimated.
Like who?
Iran, Hezbollah, potentially even Turkey, all aligned against them.
So all their enemies banding together at once.
Exactly. It's like he's envisioning a scenario where Israel is completely overwhelmed.
Just like Custer and his cavalry at Little Bighorn.
Precisely. And he argues that one of the key factors making this scenario even more alarming is the emergence of hypersonic missiles.
Hypersonic missiles.
Yeah, this is a real game changer in modern warfare.
We hear that term a lot, hypersonic missiles. But what makes them so different, so dangerous?
It comes down to speed and maneuverability.
Okay.
We're talking about missiles traveling at 5 times the speed of sound.
5 times the speed of sound. Wow.
And capable of changing course mid-flight, making them incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to intercept.
So even with our most advanced defense systems, these things are a serious threat.
They are, and it's not just the technology itself, it's who possesses it.
Right.
Russia, a major player on the world stage, has been supplying these hypersonic missiles to its allies in the region.
So it's not just about Israel and its neighbors anymore.
Exactly. This is about the shifting balance of power on a global scale.
Okay, so this is about more than just military technology.
Way more.
He's talking about a fundamental shift in the global power dynamic.
Precisely. He believes the U.S. has failed to adapt to this new reality.
In what way?
We're clinging to outdated strategies and alliances,
Interesting.
and this potential conflict in the Middle East.
Mhm.
He sees it as a microcosm of this larger dynamic playing out on a global scale.
So it's like this little bighorn scenario isn't just a possibility, it's a symptom of a much larger problem.
It's a warning sign, a potential flashpoint in a world on the brink of a major realignment of power.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's vital that we try to understand these complexities, because what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East.
Right.
The ripple effects of this potential conflict have the potential to be felt globally.
And the emergence of hypersonic missile technology just adds a whole other dimension of danger and uncertainty to the mix.
Exactly. It's a game changer, and it raises a critical question.
Which is?
In a world where such destructive power is becoming increasingly accessible, can the old strategies of deterrence and military superiority really keep us safe?
That's a question I think we're going to be grappling with for quite some time.
Oh, and it's not just about, military might anymore. It's
Right.
about economics. It's about global influence.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the rise of alternative power structures.
He mentioned something called BRICS.
Yeah.
What is that, and how does it fit into all of this?
Right. So BRICS, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Okay.
And essentially, it's a group of countries that are coming together
Okay.
to challenge the existing world order,
Okay.
the one that's been dominated by the U.S. for decades.
So they're offering an alternative,
Exactly.
a different way of doing things.
A different way of doing things. They're creating their own financial systems,
Okay.
their own trade agreements, their own security alliances.
Interesting.
They're saying to the world, hey, there's another way,
Right.
a way that doesn't involve bowing to the demands of the U.S.
And the colonel sees this as a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony.
He does. He sees the growing influence of BRICS as a sign that the world is moving on,
Okay.
whether the U.S. wants to admit it or not.
Right.
And he argues that the U.S.'s response, this doubling down on military intervention
Mm-hmm.
and unilateral action is only going to further alienate us from the rest of the world.
So it's like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah,
We can either adapt to this new reality,
right.
or we can cling to the old ways and risk becoming increasingly isolated.
Precisely. And what's worrisome is that he sees the current administration as being completely out of touch
Really?
with this reality. He argues that they're still operating under this Cold War mentality,
Okay.
this belief that the world is divided into two camps, us and them,
Right.
good guys and bad guys.
Yeah. And that kind of thinking can be dangerous, especially in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar.
Exactly. It leads to a lack of nuance,
Right.
a failure to understand the complexities of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he sees happening in the Middle East.
Okay. How so?
He argues that the U.S. is so focused on propping up Israel,
Right.
on maintaining its military dominance in the region,
Okay.
that it's failing to see the bigger picture,
Which is?
that the old strategies aren't working.
Okay.
You can't bomb your way to peace.
Right.
Lasting stability requires dialogue,
Hmm.
compromise, or recognition of the legitimate grievances of all parties involved.
So what he's suggesting is a radical departure from the way the U.S. has been operating for decades.
He's calling for a fundamental reassessment of our foreign policy priorities.
Okay.
A shift away from militarism and towards diplomacy. A recognition that our own security is inextricably linked to the security and well-being of others.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But if he's right about the potential consequences of continuing down this path,
Yeah.
it's a conversation we desperately need to have.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation that he believes needs to happen now
Okay.
before it's too late.
He seems to imply that the U.S. is not just complicit in Israel's actions,
Yeah.
but potentially even responsible for setting this dangerous course in motion.
He touches on that.
Okay.
He points to the events of October 7th as a potential turning point,
Right.
suggesting that there might be more to the story than meets the eye.
He hinted at potential collusion
Right.
Does he elaborate on that at all?
He doesn't go into specifics in this particular interview,
Oh, okay.
but he does imply that the U.S. might have played a role in creating the conditions that led to the attacks.
And remember, he said these attacks were a major catalyst
Yeah,
for Netanyahu's current strategy.
exactly.
This war of annihilation you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so if the U.S. did indeed play a role in those events,
Right.
even indirectly,
Mm-mm.
it raises some very uncomfortable questions about our own accountability in this escalating crisis.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it definitely challenges the narrative we often hear about the U.S. as a force for peace and stability in the region.
It does, and it speaks to this larger point he's making,
Which is?
about the need for critical thinking,
Okay.
for questioning the narratives we're being fed by those in power.
Don't just accept the headlines.
Don't just accept the headlines.
Do your own research. Consider multiple perspectives.
Exactly. He argues that an informed and engaged citizenry
Yeah,
is the best defense against the kind of reckless decision-making
right.
that could lead to the catastrophic outcomes he's outlined.
It's about recognizing that our responsibility extends beyond our own borders.
Yes.
That the choices our leaders make have real and lasting consequences
Absolutely.
for people around the world.
He's calling for a fundamental shift in our thinking. Okay.
A move away from the kind of exceptionalism and militarism
Right.
that has characterized so much of U.S. foreign policy.
Towards a more nuanced,
Right.
collaborative, and ultimately more peaceful approach.
Precisely. He acknowledges that this won't be easy,
Right.
that there are powerful forces
Yeah.
invested in maintaining the status quo.
But he seems to believe that it's not impossible.
Yeah.
That if enough people wake up to the danger and demand a different path, change is still possible.
He ends on a note of cautious optimism,
Okay.
suggesting that while the road ahead may be difficult,
Right.
we have a moral imperative to try.
To choose hope over despair, action over apathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He leaves us with the understanding that the future isn't predetermined,
Yeah.
that it's shaped by the choices we make today.
And that our choices matter now more than ever. So we're facing a potential crisis in the Middle East.
Yeah,
U.S. influence seems to be waning.
right.
And we have leaders who seem either unable or unwilling to change course.
It's a bleak picture. It is.
But I do appreciate that he offers a call to action.
He does urge us to pay attention,
Yeah.
demand accountability, and push for a different approach
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
foreign policy.
It's a stark reminder
It is.
that even in the face of these seemingly insurmountable challenges,
Yeah.
our voices and actions still matter.
We're not just passive observers in all of this. We have the power to influence things.
He's saying we're not powerless.
But where do we direct that action? What do we do?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of holding our elected officials accountable,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to foreign policy and military interventions.
So contacting our representatives, speaking out against policies we disagree with,
Exactly.
supporting organizations working for peace and diplomacy.
He also stresses critical thinking,
Okay.
questioning the narratives
Right.
that are being fed to us by those in power.
Don't just accept the headlines.
Don't just accept the headlines.
Do your own research.
Right.
Consider multiple perspectives.
Right. He argues that an informed and engaged citizenry is really the best defense against that kind of reckless decision-making that could lead to the catastrophic outcomes he's outlined.
It's about recognizing that our responsibility isn't just to ourselves, it's to the wider world.
But the wider world, our leaders' choices have real and lasting consequences for people everywhere.
He's calling for a fundamental shift in our thinking,
He is.
away from this sort of exceptionalism and militarism
Yeah.
that has been a part of U.S. foreign policy for so long,
For far too long.
towards a more nuanced,
Right.
collaborative, and ultimately more peaceful approach.
Precisely. And he acknowledges that,
Yeah,
this won't be easy.
Right.
There are powerful forces that are invested in maintaining the
Yep.
status quo.
but he seems to believe that if enough people wake up to the danger
Yeah.
and demand something different,
Demand a different path.
that change is still possible.
He ends on a note of cautious optimism, I'd say, suggesting that while the road ahead may be difficult, we have a moral imperative to try.
To choose hope over despair, action over apathy.
Exactly, to not give in to cynicism,
Right.
to believe that we can still create a better future.
That the future isn't predetermined.
Right, it's shaped by the choices we make today.
This reminds me of a quote, actually,
Oh, yeah.
by the writer James Baldwin.
Okay.
He said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually."
I love that quote.
And I think it speaks to what this colonel is saying.
He clearly cares deeply about the fate of his country and the world.
Yeah, and it's that concern that fuels his call to action.
He's urging us to look beyond the headlines, to question the narratives we're being fed, and to recognize our own agency in shaping a better future.
Well said. And on that note,
Yeah.
we'll leave you with this.
Okay.
Is a Little Bighorn scenario for Israel a foregone conclusion?
Right. Is it too late?
Or is there still time to avert this potential disaster?
That's the question we all have to grapple with.
And that's the deep dive for today.
As always, it's been a pleasure.
We encourage you to continue exploring these issues,
Yes.
to engage in thoughtful conversations,
Absolutely.
and to demand better from our leaders.
Because ultimately, the future is not something that just happens to us.
Right.
It's something we create together.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep asking the hard questions.